Turning on the news these days, it's like, whoa, haven't things changed?
Yeah. Tell me about it.
It seems like just yesterday we were all worried about, like, pandemics, and now it's war in Europe and rising tensions in Asia.
It's a wild time for sure. And you're right. It really underscores how crucial it is to have a strong defense strategy. You know what we're doing today, what we decide today, it's going to have a ripple effect for decades to come.
No pressure. Right. So that's why we're diving headfirst into the core of U.S. defense planning today. We're talking about the 2022 National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review.
Yeah, think of these documents as the blueprints for how the U.S. is going to navigate this pretty critical time in global security.
It's a lot, and it can be a little dense, so we're going to break it all down for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, first up, the National Defense Strategy, or NDS. And let me tell you, it paints a picture of the world that's a bit, how to put this delicately, intense.
Yeah, intense is a good word for it.
So let's jump right in. We're talking major shifts in global power dynamics, with China emerging as like the top competitor, right?
Yeah, and the NDS, it actually uses this term pacing challenge to describe China, which honestly sounds a little nicer than it actually is.
Right, it's not like a friendly foot race.
No, not at all. It's more like, imagine a company like Amazon, but with like military might. They're growing rapidly across the board, and they're looking to be the dominant global power.
Okay, so we've got China on the rise, and as if that wasn't enough, we have these mind-blowing tech advances happening at like warp speed, hypersonic weapons, AI, running warfare, cyber attacks. They could basically shut down entire countries. It's a bit much.
It's a lot to keep track of, and the thing is, it's not just the technology itself, it's how it's changing the entire landscape of warfare. I mean, we're talking about countries now engaging in what they call gray zone operations.
Gray zone, what's that like, the Twilight Zone?
Kind of. It's like this space between peace and actual war. So think cyber espionage, economic pressure, disinformation campaigns designed to cause chaos. It's hard to even define what an attack is these days.
It's like playing a game where the other side keeps changing the rules on you.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, you've got curveballs, like climate change and potential pandemics, these transboundary issues that just add another layer of complexity.
Yeah, it's like the world's most complicated game of chess.
And here's the kicker. What we're dealing with now, it's not just a repeat of past challenges. This is fundamentally different. For the first time ever, the U.S. is facing two major nuclear-armed powers simultaneously, China and Russia.
So it's like instead of one high-stakes chess match, we're playing on two boards at once.
You got it. And to make things even more intense, these new technologies, especially hypersonics and advanced cyber capabilities, they make conflict escalation much faster and more unpredictable.
Okay, that's unsettling. And to add another log to the fire, the NDS says that both China and Russia are actively looking for weaknesses in how the U.S. wages war.
They're studying us, learning from our past conflicts, and developing strategies to counter our strengths. It's a whole new ballgame.
And this new ball game requires a whole new playbook, right? Which is where this concept of integrated deterrence comes into play. Integrated deterrence. So it's like not just about flexing your muscles anymore.
It's definitely not just about having the biggest guns anymore. It's about using everything you've got: military power, diplomacy, economic influence, cyber capabilities, intelligence sharing, even shaping global norms and public opinion. It all factors in.
Wow. So it's really about bringing all aspects of national power together to make any kind of aggression completely unthinkable.
Exactly. Make it too risky, too costly, not worth the effort. That's the message.
I can see how that would make a potential adversary hesitate. But how do you actually deter countries that always seem to be pushing the limits, testing the boundaries?
That's where this idea of tailored deterrence comes in. You have to really understand each adversary, what motivates them, what are their capabilities, their weaknesses, and then you tailor your approach accordingly.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal.
Not at all. And actually, if you look at the NDS, it has separate sections on deterring China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. They're really breaking it down.
It's like a custom-made suit of armor for each opponent.
Exactly. Because what works with one might not work with another. For example, with China, the document talks about being more upfront, more assertive in their messaging. But with Russia, it's more about strengthening NATO, presenting a united front.
So different approaches for different challenges. Makes sense.
Yeah.
As I was reading through all this, a couple of things really jumped out at me. There's this big emphasis on resilience, for example.
Resilience is huge. And it's not just about being tough. It's about being able to bounce back quickly from any kind of attack. Think redundant systems, secure supply chains, the ability to adapt and keep going even when things get tough.
Being prepared for anything. I like it. And then there's this whole focus on allies and partnerships. It's like the U.S. is realizing they can't do it all alone anymore.
They're definitely recognizing that the NDS actually calls their network of alliances and partnerships their greatest global strategic advantage. And it makes sense. When you stand together, share intelligence coordinate actions, it sends a much stronger message.
Strength in numbers, for sure. Which leads us to a topic that always seems to be in the headlines, nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
It's some heavy stuff, especially with everything else going on in the world.
No doubt about it. And there's understandable anxiety around it. The 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, it makes it clear that the U.S. is committed to modernizing its nuclear forces. But it's important to understand why. It's not about starting an arms race or anything like that. It's about ensuring that their nuclear deterrent remains credible in this new global landscape.
So maintaining that balance of power, making sure nobody actually wants to push that button.
Exactly. The U.S. is not looking to use nuclear weapons in a first strike scenario. Their sole purpose is to deter attacks on the U.S. or their allies. And here's the key. That includes deterring attacks using non-nuclear weapons that could have really devastating strategic effects.
Okay, that's a bit nuanced, but super important.
Yeah.
So even a massive cyber attack or a strike with hypersonic weapons could potentially trigger a nuclear response.
It's about deterring all forms of strategic attack, no matter what tools someone might try to use.
It's like saying, don't even think about it, we're watching.
Yeah.
But it does raise the question, if the U.S. is serious about reducing nuclear risks, why not just get rid of them altogether?
That's the ideal, right? A world without nuclear weapons. But the NPR acknowledges that while also pointing out that we're a long way from that. As long as their countries possess them, the U.S. feels it needs to maintain a credible deterrent.
It's a tough balancing act, trying to deter threats while also working towards disarmament.
Exactly. And the NPR stresses that diplomacy is absolutely crucial. It emphasizes the U.S. commitment to arms control and non-proliferation, trying to reduce those nuclear risks through dialogue and cooperation.
It's a multi-pronged approach for sure. And speaking of the NPR, a couple of specific decisions about the U.S. nuclear arsenal really jumped out at me. First, there's the retirement of the B-83-1 gravity bomb.
Yeah, that one caused a bit of a stir. But it actually tells us a lot about how the U.S. views future threats. The B-83-1, it was a massive high-yield weapon, basically designed for targeting hardened bunkers and other Cold War relics. By retiring it, they're signaling a shift away from that large-scale nuclear war scenario and focusing more on deterring these limited nuclear attacks and those strategic attacks using non-nuclear weapon that we were talking about.
So it's about being more flexible and adaptable, having the right tool for the job.
Precisely. And the second decision that got people talking was the cancellation of the Nuclear-Armed Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Program, or SLCMN for short.
Yeah, that one seemed counterintuitive. Why cancel a new nuclear weapon when things seem to be getting more dangerous?
It all goes back to tailoring the tools to the threats. The NPR basically says the SLCMN was unnecessary because the W-762 low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead, which was already being developed, provides enough deterrent capability against those more limited nuclear attack scenarios.
So it's like having a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
You can be much more precise and target. But what about all those other missiles out there? The ones that aren't carrying nukes?
Ah, yes. That's where the Missile Defense Review comes in. It's all about protecting the U.S., their forces and allies from ballistic and cruise missiles, including those hypersonic weapons that everyone's worried about.
And those are a whole other beast. We're talking missiles traveling at multiple times the speed of sound, maneuvering in unpredictable ways, potentially carrying both conventional and nuclear payloads. It's a serious threat.
The MDR doesn't sugarcoat it either. It acknowledges that missile defense is getting harder and harder. It talks about how the lines between regional and homeland missile defense are blurring. What used to be a regional threat could now potentially reach the U.S. mainland.
So our traditional missile defense systems like the ground-based mid-course defense system might not cut it anymore.
You're catching on. The MDR really emphasizes the need for a more agile and adaptable approach to missile defense, one that uses both offensive and defensive capabilities, and get this a much greater emphasis on international cooperation.
Because you can't exactly build a dome over the entire planet. You need to work with your allies to share information, coordinate defenses, and develop new technologies to counter these evolving threats.
Exactly. It's a team effort. And the MDR goes into some pretty interesting details about how the U.S. plans to do this. Everything from strengthening NORAD with Canada to working with partners like Japan and Australia on hypersonic defense.
Sounds like a global challenge requires a global response. We've covered a lot here, a changing world, new and evolving threats. But before we get too deep into the weeds of missile defense, let's take a step back and think about the big picture. What does all of this mean for the road ahead? It's a lot. It's like, whoa, where do we even begin with all of this?
Right. It can feel overwhelming, but that's what we're here for. to break it down.
Exactly. So zooming out, looking at the big picture, what does this road ahead look like for the U.S.?
Well, the good news is the NDS, it doesn't just lay out all the challenges. It also offers a roadmap for how the U.S. can actually build what they call enduring advantages. And that's about being proactive, not reactive. It's about shaping the future security environment instead of just reacting to every crisis that pops up.
Okay, so less firefighting, more fire prevention.
Got it. Exactly. And one of the biggest opportunities for the U.S. is leveraging that incredible engine of American technological innovation.
Right, we've been talking about all these cutting-edge technologies, AI hypersonics, directed energy weapons. It's a lot.
It is, and the potential is huge.
Yeah.
These aren't just buzzwords. We're talking about potential game changers, and the U.S. has a real opportunity here to lead the way in how they're developed, and just as importantly, how they're actually used.
Because it's one thing to have the coolest gadgets. It's another to know how to actually use them effectively.
You got it. The NDS really stresses this idea that the U.S. military needs to become much more agile, more adaptable in its thinking. They need to develop entirely new operational concepts that fully leverage these emerging technologies, not just try to tack them onto old ways of doing things.
So it's like a whole new way of thinking about warfare.
Exactly. And let's not forget the importance of partnerships. The U.S. has this incredible network of allies around the world. Nobody else has that. And by deepening those relationships, sharing intelligence, coordinating strategies, even co-developing these new technologies, they can present a much stronger, more unified front.
There's that strength in numbers idea again. It's like that old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But it's not all smooth sailing, right? There are still some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. The NDS is very upfront about that. They talk about the need for some serious soul-searching within the Department of Defense itself, streamlining bureaucracy, cutting through red tape, creating a more innovative and responsive culture from top to bottom.
Which, let's be honest, is easier said than done. We're talking about a massive organization with its own ingrained habits and ways of doing things, shifting from risk aversion to embracing agility, especially when it comes to things like acquiring new tech and developing new forces. That's going to take some serious effort.
It's like trying to turn a battleship on a dime. It
Yeah.
takes time, but it is possible. And if the U.S. wants to keep pace with how quickly the security environment is changing, it's not just an option, it's essential. And then there's the whole issue of the U.S. industrial base.
Right, that came up a lot. The need to revitalize domestic manufacturing.
The NDS is very clear on that, making sure they have the capacity to actually produce all of these advanced weapons and technologies, not just during peacetime, but also if a major conflict breaks out. You need to be able to rely on your own industrial base.
So it's not just about national security. It's about economic security, too.
Yeah,
And creating jobs,
yeah.
which is something that resonates with a lot of people.
Absolutely. It's about reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, bringing those manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. where they can be better controlled. But here's the thing that often gets overlooked in these discussions about technology and strategy. None of it matters without the right people.
It all comes back to people in the end.
Always. The biggest challenge, the one that underpins everything else, is recruiting, training, and retaining the incredibly talented and skilled workforce that the military is going to need for this future we've been talking about. A future that's complex, technologically driven, and constantly evolving.
And we touched on this earlier, but we're talking about more than just technical expertise here.
Right. It's not just about having engineers and scientists, although those are critical. It's about cultivating critical thinking adaptability, a deep understanding of how the world works on a strategic level. It's about fostering a military culture that values diversity of thought and inclusion, and this constant drive to learn and adapt because the world isn't standing still, and neither can they.
So much to think about. We've covered a transformed world, emerging threats, evolving strategies.
Oh.
If our listener takes away just one thing from all of this, what should it be?
That's a great question. I think the key takeaway here is this. We're living through a pivotal moment in history, the decisive decade, as they call it in the NDS. The choices being made today by leaders in the U.S. and around the world, these choices will have a ripple effect for years to come. It's a lot of responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity to shape a more secure, more prosperous future.
It can feel overwhelming at times, but it's also a call to action in a way. Understanding these issues, engaging in these conversations, that's how we contribute to a better future.
I completely agree. And that's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive. So to leave you with something to ponder, how will these strategic choices, the shift to integrated deterrence, the focus on cutting-edge tech, the emphasis on strong alliances, how will this shape the geopolitical landscape in the years ahead? And what role will the U.S. ultimately play in that evolving world?
The million-dollar questions, for sure. and ones we'll keep exploring here on The Deep Dive. We'll be back next time with more sources, fresh perspectives, and all the insights you need to stay informed and engaged in this decisive decade. Thanks for joining us.